Why was she sitting alone? The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, that particular buzz that lives in every military mess hall, the one that gets into your bones after enough years, the one that becomes white noise until suddenly it doesn't. Lieutenant Marcus Tank Rodriguez balanced his tray. Grilled chicken, rice, vegetables, the same meal he'd eaten 100 times before. The same routine that made the chaos of Naval Base Coronado feel almost normal, almost predictable. But nothing about that Tuesday evening would be predictable. His teammates called from their usual spot, the table near the windows overlooking the Pacific. Jake Wizard Chen was already 3 stories deep into another weekend conquest. Danny Crash O'Brien was working on his third plate. These men were his brothers, forged in the hell of Bud S training, bonded by the kind of suffering most people couldn't imagine, the kind that weeds out 80% of candidates, the kind that leaves only the strongest, the most determined, the ones who refuse to quit. Tank had survived it all, 6 months out now, still carrying that swagger, that unshakable confidence that comes from knowing you're one of the elite. The seal trident on his chest caught the light as he moved through the mess hall, a symbol that had cost him 2 years of preparation, 24 weeks of hell. Everything he'd worked for, compressed into a piece of metal that said more than words ever could. He'd grown up in East Los Angeles, where respect wasn't given, it was taken. His father had been a construction foreman, his mother a hospital administrator. Both had drilled the same lesson into him since childhood: stand up for yourself, never back down. Those lessons had carried him through the streets, through college football, through the brutal selection process that broke most men. But across the mess hall, something caught his attention. A woman sitting alone, corner table, navy dress blues, reading what looked like an official document. Her posture was different, squared shoulders, the kind of physical confidence that spoke of capability, authority. Her eyes moved across the page with sharp focus, the focus of someone who made critical decisions under pressure. Her auburn hair was regulation perfect. Everything about her bearing suggested she was far from ordinary. Tank couldn't place her, and that bothered him. He knew most of the personnel on base, most of the officers, most of the operators, but this woman was a ghost, a mystery sitting in plain sight. Wizard followed his gaze and shrugged. Probably some desk jockey from personnel or logistics. You know how it is. They rotate paper pushers through here all the time. But Tank wasn't convinced. Something about her said she was more. Something he couldn't name. Something that pulled at his attention even as Wizard's story continued. Even as Crash laughed through a mouthful of food. Even as the mess hall buzzed with the familiar rhythm of military life. 20 minutes passed, and Tank made a decision. He stood up, ignored the questioning looks from his teammates, and walked across the mess hall, toward the woman who sat alone, toward the officer who seemed completely content in her solitude, toward a conversation that would change everything. "Excuse me, ma'am," Tank said as he approached, his voice carrying that confident edge, the one that had helped him through countless confrontations. "I don't believe we've been introduced. I'm Lieutenant Rodriguez." She looked up from her document, steel gray eyes, absolutely steady. No surprise at his interruption, no impression made by his presence, just a measured assessment. The kind he associated with his most demanding instructors, the ones who saw through everything, the ones who couldn't be charmed or intimidated. "Good evening, Lieutenant," she replied. Calm, professional, no warmth, no hostility, just neutral acknowledgement. Tank had expected more. In his experience, people responded to him. Deference, flirtation, fear, respect, something. This woman seemed completely unimpressed by his size, his seal trident, his obvious confidence, and that irritated him more than he wanted to admit. "I noticed you sitting alone," Tank continued, pushing forward. "Mind if I ask what brings you to Coronado? I know most of the regular personnel here, but I don't think I've seen you before." "I'm sure there are many people on this base you haven't seen before, Lieutenant," she replied, those gray eyes never wavering. It's a large installation with a constantly rotating population. The dismissal was subtle, but it was there. Tank felt heat rising in his chest. He wasn't used to being brushed off, especially not by someone he assumed was probably a junior officer trying to act important. His East LA upbringing flared. His SEAL training reinforced it. Respect was demanded, not waited for. "Look, I'm just trying to be friendly here," Tank said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "I've been stationed here for almost a year now, and I like to welcome new personnel to the base. It's what we do for each other in the teams." The woman set down her document, looked at him with what he was beginning to recognize as barely concealed amusement. "I appreciate the sentiment, Lieutenant, but I'm quite comfortable managing my own introduction to base personnel." Tank's annoyance grew into something sharper. He prided himself on reading people, but this woman gave him nothing. Professional but dismissive, confident but not arrogant, completely immune to his usual charm offensive, and that was unacceptable. "You know what?" Tank said, deciding to cut through the formality. "Maybe we got off on the wrong foot here. How about you tell me your rank and we can start this conversation over on the right footing?" The mess hall continued around them, dozens of conversations creating constant background noise, but Tank's focus was entirely on this woman, this officer who refused to give him the respect he'd earned, the respect he deserved, the respect that came with his trident. What Tank didn't know was that everyone else in the room had already recognized her. What Tank didn't understand was that his teammates had stopped talking, that nearby tables had gone quiet, that dozens of eyes were watching this interaction with a mixture of horror and fascination. What Tank couldn't see was that he was about to learn the most important lesson of his military career. And it would come from the woman who sat alone, the woman who needed no introduction, the woman whose rank would silence the entire mess hall. What happened next, no one expected. The woman leaned back slightly in her chair. A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. Not warm, not cold, just knowing. The smile of someone who'd been underestimated before. The smile of someone who knew exactly where this conversation was heading. The smile that said she'd let this play out exactly as long as she chose. "My rank," she said quietly. "You want to know my rank?" "That's right," Tank said, his confidence still intact, still unaware, still operating under the assumption that he held the power in this conversation. "I'm a lieutenant. Been through Bud-S, been earning my place in the teams. I figure it's only fair we establish where we both stand in the chain of command." The nearby tables had gone completely silent now, but Tank didn't notice. He was too focused on this woman, this officer who seemed determined to make everything difficult, who seemed to think she was above the basic courtesy of a simple introduction. Petty Officer Chen had stopped mid-story. Petty Officer O'Brien had actually set down his fork. Both were staring at their teammate with wide eyes, with the kind of expression that comes right before a car crash, right before impact, right before everything changes. "Lieutenant Rodriguez," the woman said, and her voice carried now, not loud, but clear, the kind of clarity that cuts through noise without effort. "Before I answer your question about my rank, I want you to understand something. I want you to really hear this." Tank crossed his arms, waiting, still confident, still certain. "Respect in the military isn't about how physically imposing you are," she continued. "It's not about your training pipeline. It's not about how long you've been stationed somewhere. And it's certainly not about approaching someone you don't know and demanding they justify their presence to you." The words landed like body blows, each one precise, measured, delivered with the kind of calm that only comes from absolute authority, from complete control. "I've been watching you since you walked through that door," she said. "I've seen how you carry yourself. I've noticed how other people react to you, and I understand exactly what kind of leader you think you are." Tank's jaw tightened. His confidence was cracking, not breaking, not yet, but developing hairline fractures that would spread, that would widen, that would eventually shatter everything he thought he knew. "So let me ask you a question, Lieutenant," the woman said. "What do you think gives you the right to approach a superior officer, interrupt their work, and demand they explain themselves to you?" Superior officer. The words hung in the air. Tank's mind raced, tried to process, tried to reconcile what he was hearing with what he'd assumed. She was a superior officer, which meant what exactly? A lieutenant commander, a commander, someone a few ranks above him who he'd mistakenly treated like a peer. The woman reached up slowly, deliberately, and turned her collar so the insignia was clearly visible. 2 stars, crisp, unmistakable, catching the harsh fluorescent light. 2 stars that represented decades of service, hundreds of missions, thousands of decisions. Command responsibility that Tank couldn't begin to comprehend. Rear Admiral, upper half. Tank's world tilted. His stomach dropped. Every muscle in his body went rigid. This wasn't a lieutenant commander. This wasn't even a captain. This was a flag officer, one of the highest-ranking women in the United States Navy, someone who could end his career with a phone call, someone who commanded entire operations, someone who had forgotten more about military leadership than Tank had yet learned. And he demanded she tell him her rank, like she owed him something, like he had authority here. The silence in the mess hall was absolute now, complete. The kind of silence that comes when everyone stops breathing at once, when time seems to slow, when the only thing anyone can do is watch, wait, wonder what happens next. "I'm Rear Admiral Sarah Mitchell," she said, her voice still calm, still measured. "I command naval special warfare operations across 3 theaters. I've been in the Navy for 26 years. I've deployed to 14 countries. I've made decisions that saved lives and decisions that cost lives. And I don't owe you or anyone else an explanation for where I choose to sit in a mess hall." Tank couldn't speak, couldn't move. His face was burning, his hands were trembling. Everything he'd built, everything he'd earned, everything he thought made him powerful, it all felt like nothing, like sand slipping through his fingers. "Now," Admiral Mitchell continued, "I'm going to give you a choice, Lieutenant Rodriguez. You can walk away from this table, reflect on what just happened, and learn from it. Or you can continue standing here, and we can discuss your conduct in front of everyone present." Tank found his voice, barely. "Ma'am, I apologize, I didn't." "You didn't know," Admiral Mitchell finished for him. "I understand that. But what concerns me isn't your ignorance of my identity. What concerns me is your assumption that your rank, your training, your physical presence gave you the authority to approach me the way you did." She paused, letting the words sink in, letting Tank feel the full weight of his mistake. "Respect isn't demanded, Lieutenant, it's earned. And humility isn't weakness, it's wisdom. I suggest you take some time to think about the difference." Tank nodded once, sharp, military precise, the kind of nod that acknowledges a direct order. Then he turned and walked back to his table, through the silence, through the stares, through the weight of his own humiliation. His teammates wouldn't meet his eyes, couldn't. The embarrassment was too thick, too heavy, too complete. He sat down, set his untouched tray on the table, and realized that everything had changed, that the man who walked across the mess hall 5 minutes ago no longer existed, that the lessons his parents had taught him, the confidence Bud S. had built, the swagger he'd carried, none of it had prepared him for this moment. None of it had taught him the one thing Admiral Mitchell had shown him in less than 5 minutes, that true authority doesn't need to announce itself, that real power sits quietly in corner tables, that the strongest people in the room are often the ones who seem to need the least recognition. And Tank understood, sitting there in the silence, that he had a choice to make. He could let this destroy him, or he could let it remake him. He could see this as the end, or he could see it as the beginning of understanding what leadership actually meant, what respect actually required, what strength actually looked like when it didn't need to prove itself. But what came next, that was the real story. That was where everything truly began. She didn't speak, she simply acted. The next morning arrived like a verdict. Tank woke before dawn, hadn't really slept, just lay in his bunk replaying the conversation, every word, every moment, every failure. The kind of mental loop that carves grooves into your thinking, the kind that doesn't stop until something breaks it. He went through his morning routine mechanically, physical training, shower, uniform, each movement precise but empty, muscle memory carrying him when his mind was somewhere else, still in that mess hall, still standing in front of Admiral Mitchell, still feeling the weight of his own arrogance crushing down. The word had spread overnight. Of course it had. Nothing stays secret on a military base, especially not public humiliation, especially not when it involves a SEAL and a flag officer. Tank could feel eyes on him as he moved through the base. Hear conversations stop when he approached, see the mixture of pity and satisfaction on other faces. Some people enjoyed watching the confident fall, enjoyed seeing swagger broken. It was human nature, the need to see proof that no one is untouchable, that everyone has limits. That pride comes before the fall. Tank expected official consequences, expected to be called to someone's office, expected paperwork, expected his chain of command to tear into him for disrespecting a flag officer, expected his career to start circling the drain. What he didn't expect was the email that arrived at 800. From RADM Sarah Mitchell. To LT Marcus Rodriguez. Subject: Leadership Development Opportunity. Lieutenant Rodriguez. Report to Building 348, Conference Room B at 1400 today. Come prepared to listen and learn. Very respectfully, RADM Sarah Mitchell. Tank read it 3 times, trying to decode the meaning, trying to understand what leadership development opportunity meant when coming from the woman he'd publicly disrespected. Was this punishment disguised as professional development? Was this an elaborate setup for further humiliation? Was this mercy or judgment? He showed up 15 minutes early, because that's what you do: pressed uniform, polished shoes, military bearing that masked the anxiety churning underneath. The conference room was empty when he arrived. Standard military space. Long table, chairs, whiteboard, nothing special, nothing that explained why he was here. Admiral Mitchell arrived exactly at 1400, not a minute early, not a minute late. The precision of someone who valued other people's time, who understood that leadership started with basic respect for others. She carried a folder, set it on the table, gestured for Tank to sit. Lieutenant Rodriguez, she began, and her tone was different now. Not the measured amusement from last night, not the quiet authority that had silenced the mess hall, something else, something that felt like genuine interest. Do you know why you're here? No, ma'am, Tank said honestly. I assumed it was disciplinary action for my conduct last night. It could have been, Admiral Mitchell said. Many officers would have written you up, filed formal complaints, made an example of you to the entire command, and honestly, you would have deserved it. Tank nodded, accepted the truth of it. But I didn't call you here to punish you, she continued. I called you here because I saw something last night, after you walked away, after you sat back down with your team. I watched your face, and what I saw wasn't defensiveness, wasn't anger, wasn't the reaction of someone trying to justify their behavior. She opened the folder, pulled out several documents, performance reviews, training records, commendations. Tank's entire file spread across the table. What I saw was someone genuinely processing what happened, someone who understood they'd made a mistake and was actually thinking about why. That's rare, Lieutenant, more rare than you might think. Tank didn't speak, didn't know what to say. This wasn't the conversation he'd prepared for. Your record shows exceptional tactical skills, Admiral Mitchell said, scanning the papers. Top of your Bud S class in weapons proficiency, expert in close quarters combat, advanced intelligence gathering. You're exactly the kind of operator the Navy needs. She paused, looked up at him. But your record also shows a pattern: conflicts with authority, complaints about your leadership style from subordinates, a tendency to lead through intimidation rather than inspiration. You're tactically brilliant, Lieutenant, but you're a developmental disaster as a leader. The words should have stung, should have felt like attacks, but delivered in Admiral Mitchell's calm, factual tone, they just felt like truth. Unavoidable, undeniable truth. "So here's what I'm offering you," she said. "A choice. You can continue on your current path, excel as an individual operator, complete your missions, earn your decorations, and eventually hit a ceiling because no one will want to serve under you. No one will trust you with real leadership responsibility." She slid a document across the table. "Or you can spend the next 3 months in a leadership development program I'm running. It's intensive. It's uncomfortable. It will challenge everything you think you know about command, respect, and authority. And it will either make you a better leader or expose that you're incapable of growth." Tank looked at the document. Some kind of experimental training program, leadership principles, cultural sensitivity, inclusive command strategies, things that had never been part of his tactical training, things that had never seemed important when the job was about physical capability and mission success. "Why me, ma'am?" Tank asked. "You could have just let last night end my career. Why invest time in someone who disrespected you?" Admiral Mitchell smiled, small, genuine, the first real warmth Tank had seen from her. "Because I've been you, Lieutenant," she said quietly. 20 years ago, I was a junior officer who thought leadership meant being the toughest person in the room, who thought respect was about making others fear your authority. I had someone give me a chance to learn better, to understand that real strength is lifting others up, not putting them down." She stood prepared to leave, giving him space to decide. "You have 24 hours to accept or decline this opportunity. If you accept, you'll report to this building tomorrow at 600. If you decline, we'll both move forward and pretend this conversation never happened. Either way, no official record of last night's incident will be filed." She walked to the door, stopped, turned back. "One more thing, Lieutenant. Last night you asked me my rank. You wanted to establish the chain of command. You wanted to know where you stood in the hierarchy, but here's what I learned a long time ago. The best leaders don't ask about rank to establish dominance. They ask about experience to establish learning. They approach everyone, regardless of insignia, with the assumption that there's something valuable to discover." She left, door closing softly behind her. Tank sat alone in the conference room, document in front of him, choice laid out clearly. Continue as he was, or risk becoming something different, something better, something that required admitting he didn't have all the answers. That night Tank called his parents, told them everything. His mother listened quietly. His father asked questions. And when Tank finished explaining the situation, his father said something that settled it. "Son, the strongest men I've ever known weren't the ones who never made mistakes. They were the ones who had the courage to admit them and the humility to learn from them. Sounds like Admiral Mitchell is offering you something more valuable than any tactical training. She's offering you wisdom." Tank accepted the program, and for 3 months, Admiral Mitchell broke him down and built him back up, not through physical trials, not through tactical challenges, but through forcing him to confront every assumption he'd built his identity around. He learned that authority without empathy is just tyranny, that confidence without humility is just arrogance, that strength without wisdom is just violence waiting to happen, and most importantly, he learned that the people who need the least recognition are often the ones who deserve the most respect. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. It sits alone in mess halls, unbothered by those who don't recognize it. It carries decades of experience without needing to announce it. It offers second chances to those who show potential for growth, even when punishment would be easier. Admiral Mitchell taught Tank what his SEAL training never could, that the hardest battles aren't fought with weapons. They're fought with yourself, with your ego, with the parts of you that resist change because change means admitting you were wrong. And being wrong, that's where growth begins. That's where real leadership is born. That's where boys become men and operators become leaders worth following. Tank emerged from that program transformed. Not broken, transformed, still capable, still tactical, still strong. But now with the wisdom to know when strength means stepping back, when leadership means listening, when authority means serving those you command. Admiral Mitchell had given him something no amount of physical training ever could. She'd given him perspective. And perspective, Tank learned, was the most powerful weapon any leader could possess. Because once you truly see yourself clearly, you can finally see others clearly too. And that's when everything changes. That's when real leadership begins.